All right, fabulous. Thanks for that, Anthony. So yeah, today, really thrilled to have close colleague, collaborator, and mentor Rob Saldin with us. Rob is a director of the democracy program at the Mansfield Center and a professor of political science at the University of Montana. He received his PhD at University of Virginia, and after that had a number of prestigious fellowships at Berkeley and Harvard. He's written several books and many articles as well in both scholarly outlets and leading popular outlets as well. And I think also importantly, Rob grew up in Idaho. And so Rob, I think, knows all too well what happens when you allow your party's brand to become too soiled within a given state. Idaho is, for all intents and purposes, totally Republican controlled at virtually every level. And Rob's current state, my home state, Montana, appears to be on that path as well. So Rob, in other words, I think has really crucial insights here, both academic but also from lived experience that ought to grab our attention and make us willing to hear what he has to say. So with that, delighted to turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Cal, and thanks, Anthony, and thank you to RUBI and everyone who's on the call. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate that setup, Cal, because I'm going to share my screen here if I can, because I wanted to start today talking a bit about how I came to be interested in this, and it does go back to the Idaho of my youth, and we can maybe start here with a little trivia question. I don't know how many people on this Zoom will be familiar with these characters, but they loomed large when I was a kid. That on the left is Frank Church and his wife Bethine, and on the right, Cecil Andrus, both Democrats. And Church, of course, had a long career in the U.S. Senate, ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 1976, and 4 years later lost what for Idaho Democrats was just a devastatingly close election to this new kind of firebrand type of conservative, Steve Sims. Now, all was certainly not lost for Idaho Democrats because Cecil Andrus was still on the scene. Cecil was a four-term Democratic governor with a stint as Jimmy Carter's Interior Secretary in between each of his two terms. Now, when I was a kid, I was too young to have any memories of Frank Church. But his wife, Bethine, there, she was still a force in her own right. She was kind of the matriarch of the Democratic Party, big prominent figure in Boise, Idaho, which is where I grew up. And of course, Cecil Andrus was very much still on the scene. I knew him slightly, and he left. So his fourth term was over in January of '95. And at that time, it was not at all clear that the Democratic Party was going to go into a free fall in Idaho. Looking back, you can kind of see it, right? There had been large legislative majorities for the Republicans for a long time, but you know, there were some figures who appeared compelling and this and that. And yet, in hindsight, it's really clear that when Cecil Andrus, who had a brand of his own, when he left the stage, everything collapsed. and I'm sure most of you have a general idea of what the scene has been like in Idaho ever since. Well, I've been in Montana now for 15 years, and I feel a bit of deja vu, kind of like I'm watching a slow motion version of what I saw growing up. And of course, John Tester is still around and running for re-election, but I think everyone anticipates that being a real tough one next year. And the thing that I've come to realize over time is that the urban-rural divide really was a key factor in what happened back in Idaho in the 80s and 90s. It's a key factor. In fact, I'd say it's the key factor in what's been playing out in Montana for some years now. And as I've come to appreciate from Cal, among others, is that what's going on is not an Idaho story. It's not a Montana story. The same dynamics are at work across the country. And so Cal and I have done a couple papers for the Niskanen Center. The one I'll focus on is our more recent one from a couple months ago. It builds on the first one, Gone Country, and kind of the starting point for these papers is the recognition that look, Democrats tend to get a lot of votes. They tend to get more votes than Republicans, not always, right? Last November being one example, but they tend to get a lot of votes, yet they don't have the kind of power to show for it that you'd think. And it's been increasingly difficult for the party to gain the governing majorities and the level of power that's consistent with their national vote share. And the main reason for this is because their votes are concentrated in communities that, geographically speaking, make up a minority of the total communities throughout the country. So those votes don't translate into an equivalent amount of governing authority. And one thing that just can't be underestimated when you're looking at this problem for Democrats is the political importance of geography, right? How parties' coalitions are distributed across space. It just plays a real outsized role in American politics because of federalism and of single member districts, right? The system wouldn't have to have been designed this way, but it was. And in our kind of a federal system, because Democratic voters are overly concentrated in a minority of states and within a small number of localities within those states, political boundaries are really important. And the proportion of the population on one side of the boundary matters a great deal. And Cal and I argue in this paper that that's really a core element of the Democrats' electoral disadvantage. And we suggest in this most recent paper for Niskanen that there are two groups that you can really look to that are central to the party's geography problem. You've got rural voters, and then more broadly, working class voters. Now, I'll focus here on the rural piece of that. But just to get a feel for how bad things have gotten for Democrats in rural areas, just consider the following here. This is counties. If you look at the number of rural counties won by Democratic presidential candidates, you can see the collapse, right? So as recently as 1996, Bill Clinton wins 1,100 counties. Now, that is about half of the total rural counties in the country. 12 years later, that number has been more than cut in half, despite Obama's relatively easy national victory. Fast forward another 12 years to 2020. Biden is carrying less than 200 of these counties. And this is with a candidate who one might think would be reasonably tolerable for these types of voters, right? You can look at it in another way here. This figure shows support for the Democratic presidential nominee by community type. Now, I'll note a few things here. First, in the 1980s and well into the 90s, knowing where a voter lived didn't tell you a huge amount about their voting proclivities. But now it tells you a great deal. Point two, beginning in 1996, the growth in the urban-rural divide, it isn't spread evenly across community types. Instead, it's almost all about rural areas moving toward the GOP. Third point, note the Trump effect here. You've got this steep decline from 2012 to 2016, right? So more could be said about this, but that kind of gives you a flavor and some numbers to back up what we're talking about here. So next question is, well, what accounts for this? And Cal and I think that one thing seems to be clear, and that is that rural people's antipathy toward the Democratic Party, it cannot be just explained away by the notion that these are all a bunch of conservative ideologues. Public opinion data actually demonstrates that that's just simply not the case. Rural people actually endorse a fair number of what I think could reasonably be considered left of center policy positions when it comes to economics and healthcare and trade policy, even the environment. Now, where you do see a real divergence is on cultural and social issues, right? Guns, abortion, immigration, policing. But even so, we suggest that, look, taken together, policy is something of a push. We could argue about how much, but it's not true that rural Americans are like in lockstep agreement with the Heritage Foundation or something like this. That's not the explanation. The real place, we suggest, where you see Democrats suffering is when it comes to the party's brand. And there's a growing academic literature to which Cal has really been one of the foremost contributors, that finds that what scholars call rural resentment is the root of this brand problem. And by rural resentment, what we mean by that is just the pervasive belief among rural Americans that they have been left behind, that they have been ignored, that they are looked down upon by urbanites and the government and media elites who cater to them. So one takeaway of this research is that Democrats cannot fully fix their problems in rural America by simply moderating on cultural issues, right? That may very well help, and Cal and I think it would, but they also need to be creative in building back the trust of rural communities who see them as elitists, and elitists who not only are elitists, but who view rural communities with contempt, right? Now, we could also get into a discussion, and there's plenty that could be said about the extent to which this sense of rural resentment is accurate and reflective of reality and all of that. But what is clear in the empirical research is that this sense of rural resentment does exist. So again, rural voters are not necessarily crosswise with the Democratic Party when it comes to many core policy issues, right? The big problems emerge with the cultural touchstones that at least these days play an outsized role in shaping party stereotypes. Again, when we think about, how did we get here? Again, there's a lot that could be said. And much of it has been out of control of the Democratic Party. Although I think there are some things, for instance, the collapse of party infrastructure in much of rural America. I think the party does deserve some blame for that. But there are these larger forces at work, and the key one that we zero in on is nationalization, the nationalization of American politics. And by that, we mean just that voters increasingly make decisions on who to vote for, up and down the ballot, across the entire federal system for everything from president on down to dog catcher, based upon a narrow set of national political considerations. And again, there's a lot that could be said on this point, but just consider the collapse of local news, which is something something else that Cal and I have written fairly extensively on. You know, as local news has declined, it's been replaced by national news. So for many Americans, the local paper has effectively been replaced by Fox News. And the implication of that is that it changes the set of issues that voters are thinking about. So they're thinking less about local affairs and more about the latest outrage in Washington, right? So that's the backdrop. That's a big force pushing in this direction. So but it is what it is. And again, I think there's some things, you know, building up infrastructure and whatnot that the party could actually do, but some of this is out of its control in terms of, you know, stopping those forces. But what can Democrats actually do about this? Well, Cal and I argue that if the party is going to reverse, you know, even to a small extent, their decline in rural America, they're going to have to blunt these forces of nationalization. And it's important to note, I think, that Democrats don't need to start winning all these rural counties that they used to decades ago. If they could just cut the margins a bit, right? Losing some of these counties, you know, 65-35 would be a lot better than what they're doing right now, right? So even relatively small inroads can make a difference here. But again, to do that, we think you're going to have to do something to undermine the nationalization of American politics. And I guess I should also note maybe here that, you know, we emphasize in our writings on this topic that this really should be something that all Democrats are sympathetic to, or I guess maybe at the very least recognize as an unpleasant reality that has to be addressed. Because even if you don't care about rural America, which I don't think is the case with people on this call, but there might be some out there. But even if you don't care about rural America, or are skeptical or just outright dismissive of the concept of rural resentment, the reality is that in a world where the Senate matters and in a world where the Electoral College matters, Democrats are in a very tough position if they don't improve their standing in rural areas. Right? They usually do win more votes nationally than the Republican Party, but the geographic distribution just severely waters that dam. So, you know, running up the score in the 20 largest cities and the college towns, one of which I very happily reside in, but the large cities, the college towns, the resort communities, you know, that's not going to cut it. And so what can be done? Well, Cal and I argue that rural Democrats can do a few things to disrupt the forces of nationalization, right? They can play some defense by distancing themselves from national party stereotypes that hurt them in rural America, right? On things like guns. They can reframe national policy discussions to focus on the specific local relevance and impact of those policies. And they can go on the offense by identifying and championing what we call hyperlocal issues that are relevant to voters in particular states, but that kind of escape the national partisan discourse, right? So they don't instantaneously trigger the alarm bell that goes off that this is a Republican thing or a Democratic thing, right? That kind of fall into a zone that hasn't been captured by the parties. Right. But beyond that, we do go a step further in this latest Niskanen paper. Cal and I make the case that the best way of going about this in a kind of broader sense for party actors, right? Not just one-off candidates here and there, but for a project for an element of the party is to create a new party faction that would be attuned to rural and working class voters. And maybe it would be broader than that, or maybe it would just be focused on that. But the term faction, as we use it, right? Faction is thrown around rather loosely and used to describe all sorts of political groupings and subgroupings and whatnot. But what we mean by a faction is an institution within one of the major parties that has a whole affiliated set of politicians, of political professionals, of activists, interest groups, donors, intellectuals, so on. So the type of faction we have in mind is characterized by its formal organization and its grounding in ideas, right? As opposed to just like the charisma of some particular politician or something like that, right? So in more practical terms, what we have in mind is something like the Democratic Leadership Council or the New Democrats of the late 80s and 90s. Now, in some respects, the kind of faction we have in mind would be quite different from the DLC and from the New Dems in terms of specific policies and things like this. But it would be similar in the sense that the DLC and the New Democrats had a formal institutional structure. And that institutional structure, it was durable, right? It wasn't just a short-term thing to get a piece of legislation passed or something like this. It's durable, right? This is lasting for years and years. And that it's grounded in a set of ideas. So the practical result of the DLC and the New Dems back in the 80s and the 90s was that this kind of factional institution, it allowed political actors that were affiliated with the DLC to be able to say, hey, I'm not a Michael Dukakis Democrat, I'm a DLC Democrat. And for that distinction to be understood by a significant enough amount of people to be meaningful, right? And in certain parts of the country where Michael Dukakis was not a revered figure, right? That was very important. Now, one maybe kind of final point here that I'll make is that what we have in mind with a faction, at least in our thinking about it, this isn't some crazed shoot the moon type scheme. This kind of factional framework, it's actually been very common in the US. In fact, I would say it's been the norm, right? There has been, and here's kind of a list of these factions that have been put together by some scholars. You can see that there's been at least one active faction of the sort we have in mind in at least one of the major parties for all but about 20 years of American history since the Civil War. And then I guess I would also, I will close on this point by just saying that in my way of thinking about it, these kinds of internal divides within a party are not necessarily something to lament. Quite the contrary. This is the way I think that our two-party system has accommodated the demand that's out there for more than two options, right? In other countries, they have another way of doing it, and they have multi-party systems. And so if you want to create a new party to occupy some space that isn't being represented by the other party, great, you can do that. Well, our system pushes so hard in a direction towards two parties, it makes it so difficult for third parties that the way this has typically been done in the United States to again offer more than just two flavors is by having these intra-party factions, and to have them embedded not as separate entities, the separate party, but to have them embedded within one of the two major parties. And these factions have usually, I would argue, enhanced the functioning of our party system and our politics more generally by improving the party's ability to govern a large, diverse country. And so factions have been, I would say, the vehicles for accommodating and adding diversity in the United States. And Cal and I at least think that the time is right for just this type of an operation on the Democratic side. And so with that, I'll bring my opening comments to a close, but would look forward to hearing comments, reactions, questions, and maybe Cal can jump back in at some point if he wants to weigh into the conversation.
Rob, I'll start with a question. This is Anthony. Thank you for that presentation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could give us, and maybe Cal could join you in this, a little more sense of what the faction you're recommending would look like. Like, does it have a name? Does it have some core principles or driving ideas that would distinguish it from the mainstream of the Democratic Party, or whatever the other elements are that would make it more appealing to working class and rural folks?
Well, Cal, you should jump in here in a minute, but Cal and I haven't tried to come up with a name for this. There are some people working in this space. This is not entirely just an intellectual think piece on the part of Cal and I. There are some people interested in doing kind of exactly the type, or roughly the kind of thing we have in mind. You know, one name that's been thrown around a bit is Common Sense Democrats. I'm not sure that seems to kind of be about right in terms of the capturing the basic idea. I'm not sure about that name in particular, but there are other people who are probably in a better place to come up with names. But Cal, do you want to jump in and say a bit more about the other part of Anthony's question?
Sure. Yeah, so I think really what we have in mind, and as Rob alluded to, some other folks that are working in this space to maybe get something like this off the ground in the nearest future, is that this would essentially be a faction that caters more toward, as Rob mentioned, rural and working class constituencies, and really sort of prioritizing the sorts of issues that tend to resonate with those folks. So things like just sort of broadly speaking, an economically progressive or populist, really leading strongly with that. We think that is the part of the current Democratic brand that resonates most strongly in rural areas and working class areas. And then again, like Rob mentioned, supplementing that economic populism or progressivism with hyper local sorts of concerns to build back trust. I think another element of this, just to be totally forthcoming here, and this might rub some folks the wrong way, we think one of the issues with the Democratic Party right now, and really with both parties, is that they've been ideologically captured by a pretty narrow set of individuals. And so what we really focus on, and something that really resonates with Rob and I, because again, we didn't grow up in Berkeley, California, or Boston, or I didn't even grow up in Missoula, Montana. I grew up in a very rural part of the state. And the thing is with politics is you have to meet people where they're at. You have to meet the voters where they're at, and the Democratic Party needs to be willing to do that, we think. And so what that might look like is in rural areas, softening a little bit on some issues. If you're running a candidate in a rural area, you're trying to represent rural candidates, we believe that you ought to be more aligned with those folks on some of the issues that might make big city liberals a little squeamish. Things like guns, things like in some areas of the country, not all areas, maybe not even most rural areas, but in some rural areas of the country, that might also look like having a position on abortion that maybe many Democrats aren't totally okay with. I think we need to be a big tent party. We need to represent the diversity of rural areas. So that would, again, but I think what we really see as being core here is leaning into an economic progressivism, supplementing that with local issues, and then maybe being softer on some other issues on an as needed basis, on a district by district basis. Next question.
Can I ask a quick question? Would that be okay? Cool. I think we've exchanged information in the past. Kyle, my name is Paulo. I'm from the Outrun Coalition. We're a collective of 300 local, diverse, rural Democratic elected officials from across 14 states. And I agree a lot with what you're talking about with factionalization and making sure that there is like a conversation around like what should when the going gets going, we should all just unite around making sure that we can elect people to office. But I also noticed that in this conversation, one thing in this particular chat, there was a whole interaction where in order to get young people to run, you can't force them to like have values that they don't believe in. And I think that oftentimes when we try and run candidates who tend to pitch to the right or whatever, we sell people kind of like a fake dole of goods to make them act in a way that they don't. And it leads to honestly really bad things like having Democratic state legislators who, proclaim progressivism and stuff, switching parties and voting for trans fans, which is what happened in West Virginia with a DSA aligned state delegate. And my question is I hear you on making sure that we can all unite together, but I tend to think that this is also an issue about identity and like how we look at ourselves as like rural Democrats. So like, there's what you're talking about making a faction happen, but how can we make a faction happen when it's really difficult to appeal to young people by telling them that you have to not adhere to your values if you want to run for town council?
Well, yeah, I'd say it does have to come from a place of authenticity. And believe me, I'm on a college campus and interact with young people on a day-to-day basis. And certainly some of the things we're talking about, I think would rub them the wrong way. That's not what has drawn them to politics. Now, I would also say though that there's more to young people than just young people who are attending college and who are college graduates. And and again, I took it to the college place. You didn't mention that. You maybe were talking about young people more generally. But from what I observe, the various activist groups, tends to be much more populated by college students and college graduates, and that's not always necessarily reflective of young people in general. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I guess I'd be hesitant to tell my progressive students who think, for instance, like who are motivated very much and by trans issues and think that's one of the most important things going on right now. I wouldn't necessarily suggest to them that they pretend that that's not the case. But there are other issues, and I also just don't think that all young people in general are motivated by some of the issues that get the most attention.
And if I could follow up on that too. So yeah, to be clear, Paolo, we're not advocating for putting people on the ballot that are economically progressive, but socially conservative and very far to the right. And to some degree, we are asking for some degree of moderation on and that's going to be what that looks like. I think will be very different from district to district. And so we really have a really strong local focus here. But in general, something else that I think is important, and that comes out in the pieces that Rob and I have written, is that Democrats, like all politicians, right? All communication is strategic. You have the decision over what you have a decision to make over what you lead with, the things that you talk about, that you put front and center. And we aren't necessarily advocating for, again, people like this West Virginia example, for Democrats to get into office, go up to the state capitol and vote for things like trans bans, right? That's not that is absolutely not what we are talking about. But at the same time, we think there needs to be an institution within the party that helps candidates in rural areas run on other issues, right? They can still be allies with marginalized communities in terms of the votes that they cast in the legislature. But the things that they talk about on the campaign trail probably ought to be different than that in many rural communities, right? And so I think Montana is a good example. For those of you who've been following the news right now, Montana is in the news for all the wrong reasons, and a trans legislator, a Democrat from Missoula, maybe Rob is even in her district, I'm not sure, but this trans legislator was removed from office. And so we don't want Democrats to be siding with Representative Zephyr's detractors, right? We don't want real Democrats to vote with Republicans to censure her and remove her from office necessarily. And we think that it's great that there are trans legislators. We think that it's great that there are Democrats in college town districts like Rob's who are running on those sorts of issues and putting them front and center. But we think that Democrats running in other areas of Montana, many other areas of the country, should have the ability to really talk about other types of issues while still being allied with Democrats on many of these key hot button social issues when it comes to votes, but not necessarily when it comes to campaigning and the image and the brand that you're putting forward. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Chris Meyer. I live in Vilas County, which is arguably one of the most rural counties in the state of Wisconsin. We're a stone's throw from Michigan's UP. I've been, just a little bit about me, I've been involved with community organizing going on 30 years now up here. And I ran for assembly in 2018. I'm currently the chair of the Vilas County Dems. And we've been engaged in this kind of rebranding that you're talking about. And we do have the data to show that it's been moving the needle here over time in terms of our electoral success. So, I guess what I want to say is, I'm new to the RUBI party, though. I heard about you all, and I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. The question I have is, have you been engaging with state party leadership, Democratic state party leadership, and having these kinds of conversations with state party leadership? Or is your strategy to create this critical mass so that when you go into these conversations, you really have their attention? So I'm just curious, how things are going here. is that your intention to create the faction and then have the conversation? Or are you already having these conversations and you're facing either resistance or, they're just dismissing you, ignoring you out of hand?
Well, aside from this presentation today, I haven't had any prior interaction with RUBI. I'll let Cal address that, but I'm very interested to hear about your experience in rural Wisconsin. Would love to connect and hear more details on that.
Yeah, so, Anthony, if Anthony's still on the call, I think he would be the best for this, but I can just say briefly that I know that RUBI has been pretty actively engaged with a number of not just state parties, but county central committees across the country. We've done a lot of trainings with various central committees around the country, and that also includes the state parties. But I think even more crucially, RUBI is in the midst of piloting a program called Community Works in rural Virginia that really seeks to engage local parties on the ground and to help them be more involved in their communities in order to really, again, rebuild the trust, right? And I think this is a really crucial program, something that drew me to RUBI, because it's so consistent with what Rob and I have written about, that as Democrats, we need to focus on disrupting this narrative, this national narrative, these national stereotypes about Democrats that are pervasive in these rural communities, right? We need to disrupt that, show folks that that is a caricature, that not all Democrats are, insert your favorite national Democratic boogeyman here or boogie woman. But it sounds like you're doing great work. I agree with Christian, or with Rob. Would love to link up with you, Christian. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for that, by the way. And how do we do that?
Well, you can email one of us.
Yeah, I can jump in here.
Anthony, go ahead.
Still on the call. Chris, this is Anthony. I'm one of the co-founders, and in a nutshell, RUBI, besides these briefings, the main way we've been trying to challenge our side, progressives, liberals, and Dems, is through trainings that we do. We've done them about 45 different trainings now with probably about 2,500 people all across the country, more in rural than in urban, but in a lot of both. And the trainings are a kind of intensive look at how we got to the point of such a severe divide. Why do so many rural and working class folks not trust us, hate us, et cetera? And then what we can do about it. And we do those trainings more than anything else with local Democratic committees. We're doing them all over the country, but we also do them with state parties, and we do them with unaffiliated groups like Sierra Club and Union of Concerned Scientists and the Wisconsin Rural Coalition and the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. So the training is one thing, and if you go to our website, you can definitely check that out. We love doing that. We also did a study on how Democrats can win in rural districts and by interviewing 50 successful Democratic candidates, and that was published in the fall. A lot of what Rob and Cal have said was also reflected by the 50 candidates we interviewed. And then, as Cal said, we're launching this Community Works initiative, first in Virginia and then in North Carolina, and hopefully not too long after that in Wisconsin. But I'm gonna put my email in the chat for you and anybody else who wants to reach out.
Right. Thank you.
Mary Lockhart. Oh, you're muted, Mary.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. I'm a Texan, and I'm a Democratic County Chair in a very, very rural, small county, Brewster County, very large physically, but very small population-wise. And I've been harping on this kind of thing in a related way. There are on a national level lots of coalitions. I prefer the term coalition because it has the word co in it, as opposed to factions. You know, for example, healthcare. If you take the progressive or Democratic side of these issues, healthcare, gun safety, reproductive rights, immigration reform, the environment or climate change, gay, lesbian, all those together, all the plus, and equal civil rights. And then in this case, we're talking about a rural focused coalition. If you take all of those on the national level and you want to bring it down to a local level, what you do is you find out, do you have any activists on those particular coalitions in your local area? And we do. It might surprise you. A rather active reproductive rights coalition. And this is in Texas, where abortion has just been taken away from women. And so that's, they're growing. Those within the local rural communities in our county, those coalitions, they exist on the national level, but they're growing at a local level. And you find out who they are. And one of the most important ways to do it is to ask people. And if you ask Republicans in our district, they would say, because we are smack dab on the border with Mexico, that immigration is our biggest issue. But that's not what happens when you ask regular people. When you ask regular people, what is the biggest issue for you? It's healthcare. We're losing our hospitals. We can't get any of the care that urban districts take as a given, the ability to go to a specialist if you've got a specialty problem. And our hospitals are closing at a dramatic rate because they don't have, and we're losing nurses and doctors. And so when you ask real people what the biggest problem is here, they'll say it's healthcare, it's access to healthcare. We have people fleeing the rural areas because they can't get a doctor to take care of them, and they can't have a reliable hospital to turn to in an emergency. So what you ask people, what is the really big issue for them? And then you incorporate those coalitions within the Democratic Party. And one of the things that you convince them, you tell them what you want to achieve in your coalition on a national level, whether it's climate change or greater access to healthcare or equal rights. The only way to get that is to vote Democratic. That's, I wish that was not the case, but that is the case right now. And so that's just a way I've been thinking about this and trying to, and I'm trying with my local people to get them to incorporate those coalitions that are represented at a national level, but are somewhat active here locally. Is that, I hope that's a helpful idea.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very interesting. Just kind of piggybacking off of that, I think one of the key things that Cal and I are emphasizing in this most recent piece is, there are lots of groups and lots of efforts to do this or that. There's also a lot of energy that goes into single issue kind of thing. And there are a whole bunch of people who are focused on kind of systemic changes, adding states or, expanding the size of the Supreme Court. And we could debate all those things. One of the One of the challenges, though, in all of this is how do you do something that's actually sustainable and durable? And that's one of the key elements of the successful factions that I had on that list earlier, is that they have been durable, right? And so how do you really institutionalize that? One of the another thing we could do, and in fact we do in this paper, use John Tester here in Montana as an example of a Democrat who's been particularly effective at doing a lot of the things that we encourage. One thing, though, that is missing is that there isn't that kind of durable, institutionalized thing, right? Tester has his own one-off brand, and we could identify some other people who have that, and we could identify some people in the Republican Party who have that, right? People like Larry Hogan or Charlie Baker, although they're both now out of office. But one of the reasons why, on the Republican side, think about the Hogans and the Bakers. One of the things that was missing there is that there was no institutional structure to it. It was just these two guys who had their own little brand going. And I guess that's fine here or there, but to really address the problems that the Democratic Party has right now in rural areas with working class voters, it would be much better to not just have a one-off candidate in some random place, be it Montana or Texas or Wisconsin or what have you, but to have it be part of a broader effort to really institutionalize these things, right? That's the way over the course of American political history that these things have been more effective, right? You can always find some instance of one person doing it really well, but the trick is being able to expand on that and have these people be linked together and to create your own set of party professionals who run campaigns and a set of affiliated intellectuals and people who are writing magazine articles and things like that, making the case, right? Those are the elements that have always been the part of successful party factions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just piggyback really quick, and then we'll move to the next question. Totally agree on the healthcare access thing. Rural clinics are essential. And, this sort of underscores a bigger point. Democrats need to be better at talking about the things that they do and that they're for and relating those to rural areas. So for example, Medicaid expansion helps rural clinics stay open. It keeps access available to people in rural areas. And yet, so for example, Montana, we passed Medicaid expansion and no Democrats were out there making that case in Montana. They were not linking their own policy successes and translating that into, well, how does this benefit rural communities? So yeah, need to be better at that. Mona?
You're going to be sorry that you called on me. I think I'm going to play devil's advocate because I've been perspiring ever since I read your study. And that might be because I work for the Michigan Democratic Party and I'm an organizer, full-time organizer. And this is something that I would recommend you go back to your state parties and if they don't have 24-hour, 365-day-a-year organizers on the ground to serve all of you, I really recommend that. This program that we have started in 2017, and we're there all the time. We're not just there during the election cycle. So I just want to get to the point of how the part about more factions in allied groups that have the same values we have. We've got Indivisible, we've got just tons of different factions and different movements and different groups so that people complain, why don't we have a cohesive message? And I would argue it might be because of that. But I mean, where are the resources going? Are we expecting that the party then is going to fund or help fund these organizations? Something's happening in our state right now, even though we've got organizers on the ground, is that on top of our rural caucus, another organization wants to come into existence that wants to sort of be nonpartisan. There's argument about that. So wouldn't it be better, this is rhetorical, I guess, wouldn't it be better if the rural Democrats were strong in their identity as rural Democrats, and you define that the way you want to, but then you work to build the infrastructure in your county party, your local party, your rural caucus? I know this kind of goes against the grain of what we're saying here today, but I think that the party itself has been depleted because of, I mean, the power of the party, and even with resources depleted because of all of these different factions.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess I would say no, I don't see those as being in tension. And I largely agree with you. I mean, Cal and I have written about this, and you know, how, at least with the benefit of hindsight, there were some rather disastrous decisions made by the Democratic Party, and they kind of made sense at the time. But yet, you know, one of my favorite examples, you go back, what was it, the 2006 cycle, maybe? You had this debate between Howard Dean. Howard Dean had what he called the 50-state strategy. And Rahm Emanuel was in charge of the House Campaign Committee in the same cycle. And he didn't like the 50-state strategy because he said, look, we're trying to win a majority this cycle. You know, I don't want to send party money to Mississippi. I want to have it, you know, here in this and that race where we can actually make a difference. And of course, that makes all the sense in the world in any given cycle. But over the long term, it's disastrous when you hollow out the local parties. And, you know, I guess maybe, Cal, it's in our first paper where we document what happened in South Dakota, which I think is just such a great example. I mean, the South Dakota Democrats have hardly any infrastructure at all, right? And this is, I mean, that's a great example. I mean, I talk about Idaho and Montana, but you want to see a brutal collapse of a party, you know, South Dakota is a great place to look. It was not that long ago when they had a full Democratic congressional delegation, and now it just appears to be totally hopeless. So I totally agree with you in the sense that you've got to have that infrastructure at the local level, and I don't though see that as incompatible with what Cal and I are writing about and the idea of factions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one just as a point of clarification too, so everything that Rob said, spot on. I think some of the some of those groups that you were throwing out, I would refer to as interest groups rather than as party factions. These are groups sort of even more outside the party than what we have in mind. But I think what Rob and I sort of have in mind with this faction is, again, just an institutionalized group that you know, a group of folks that focuses on candidate recruitment and fundraising specifically for Democrats in rural areas. Maybe you know, a group of various operatives, pollsters, consultants, these types of folks that they can turn to and know that they're standing by in the stable to really help rural and urban, rural and working class Democrats. And so what we don't have in mind is like further bleeding the, you know, the state parties for money or anything like that. In fact, I think Rob and I hope that there could be some synergy with you know, state and local parties and factions, as this faction is able to hopefully corral, you know, a group of donors and to impress upon them the need of investing in local parties, state local parties. I am getting the signal from the RUBI folks that we need to start wrapping up, but maybe time for one more question, and then any other questions that we didn't get to, again, please feel free to email Rob or I dropped those emails in the chat. I'll do that again here in a moment. But Sherry Jacobson, maybe last question.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I'm in the middle of Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania. And I guess I have a lot of different thoughts about the conversation and your work, and all really interesting food for thought. I think it's worth distinguishing between the ways in which Republicans have represented certain issues and the issues themselves. Here where I live, we have trans folks, we have gay folks. So, people have trans kids, they have trans siblings. I don't think that's inherently a losing issue, but I think the hyperbolic or cartoonish way that Republicans have painted it is particularly divisive. And we can just go down abortion or baby killer, and I don't think we should run from issues that are really at the core of the kinds of freedoms and liberties that the Democratic Party prides itself on promoting, simply because the Republicans have, for the moment, used these issues to be divisive. And so that's one thing. I think Josh Shapiro was really good at representing a lot of our issues as a matter of freedom, as a matter of liberty. Those are things that play obviously quite well anywhere in America, right? Everybody likes those things. I have a lot more thoughts, but I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to toss that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Did you want to say anything to that?
Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, that's a very real tension in all of this. I think, Cal and I come at this to some degree as trained political scientists, and there is empirical data out there on this, and of course it's a moving target, and things change, and I think that's I think the point is well taken to a degree. Take the abortion issue. It really matters a great deal, as I'm sure many of you know, the way in which you ask these questions, the kind of responses you get. It does seem to Cal and I, and again, there's empirical evidence on this, that abortion is one of those things that by and large is not something that helps Democrats to be talking about in a lot of the communities that we're focused on. Now, I'm sure there are some exceptions, and things might change. In fact, one thing I've thought a lot about is the degree to which Dobbs shakes things up in that particular policy space, and so that might very well create some new opportunities for Democrats to talk about that issue in a way that's beneficial. One little indicator I have, Cal mentioned this issue in Montana that sprang up a week or two ago on trans, having to do with various trans issues. And one of the things that I have noticed is that Republicans in Montana have been all over this. They want to make this the biggest issue. They want, when anyone thinks about Montana Democrats, they want them to think about this. And, that tells me at least that Republicans, now maybe they're misguided on this, but Republicans at least think that this is an issue that is going to work very well for them in Montana.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So Paolo, are you still on the call? So I'll turn the floor over to you, but just again, if anyone wants to email Rob and me, just send us some emails. I dropped those in the chat, and I'll do that again while Paolo is talking.